Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who've been here, you already know this. We are celebrating the New Museum's 40th anniversary with this two-day series of conversations with 40 artists. And I'm extremely excited to be here with Anri Sala and Camille Henrot, both of whom have had solo exhibitions with the New Museum really in the recent past. Anri, you were in 2016. And Camille in 2014. Both of you work really across a whole range of media and subjects, but I think some of the similarities in your work is the way you're thinking about experiences of foreignness, history and time. Anri, with you, is this idea of rupture, and the way time also bears on your experiences of moving images and music. But your works are also very different. I think, Anri, your films can be much more austere and contemplative, and Camille, anyone who remembers your New Museum show would remember Grosse Fatigue, which is kind of dizzying suite of images and constellated associations, and it has a very different tenor to Anri's work. But nonetheless, I think we're gonna have quite a bit to talk about, and we already kind of got started a few hours ago. So I guess I wanted to pick up on maybe the last thread that we dropped before we came up on stage, because this is something I've been thinking about with both of you, which is your relationship to language, both kind of personally in terms of your presence and existence in the world, and also in your work. So I wondered if we could open with that and maybe discuss, first of all, how working in different languages has influenced your work, how maybe moving places and being in a context where there's a foreign language has influenced your thinking about language and other things. So I don't know and remember to speak in English.
Yes. Yeah, we were speaking in French just before, and thinking about your question about language. And at first I was thinking, oh, I have really nothing to say about language. But then I realized that when I moved to New York, my approach to language completely changed. And it's true that language became more of a topic in my work, especially in the sense of the feeling of returning back to childhood. I felt like moving back to New York was like having 7-year-old again, and expressing with a very basic range of words, and it in a way it was very freeing, and it was a starting point for working on projects like the Office of Unreplied Email, which is really a writing project, a bit like a diary, and it was written in English and in French, mixing both language. And it was very freeing to talk in a language that is not yours.
Can you say a few words about this project for those who aren't familiar with it?
It's a project that was first exhibited at the Berlin Biennale, I think last Berlin Biennale. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit more than 100 emails from my mailbox that were selected, that all addressed to me, but they don't really address to me. It's the email of Chase, of change.org, and all this.
All these kind of mass marketing emails.
Sierra Club, a lot of organization, a lot of activist organization, and also a lot of organism and companies that would address to me with my name, like, dear Camille, you have to act before midnight. This is your last change to save the polar bear, or dear Camille, we didn't get your feedback on your new credit card. So this was this type of message that I decided to answer, inventing a character which is not me, which is a bit of a mixture of a Beckett character and Monsieur Test of Paul Valéry, sort of like hyper-sensitive and extremely over concern with detail character who would just reply to all the message of feel the duty of replying of all the message of the mailbox. But the message of the mailbox are not just messages, they are requests from the world. They are what the world expects you to do, whether it's giving a feedback on a product, on a ride with Uber, or whether it's acting on climate change.
Anri, what about for you? I know that language. When I think of your work, I think of the absence of language in one of your earliest videos, Entrevista, which is the video where you used this footage you had found where the soundtrack was missing, and then language kind of has a play in later in your works as it becomes much more and more like sound.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, luckily I had a bad start with language from the beginning, in the sense that this film Entrevista with my mother, it was a film about, I found this footage where she was giving an interview, but the sound was lost, and I was trying to find out what she said. It was clearly in a political setting during the time of before the end of the regime. So in a way, it was a bit like an archaeological approach where you try to undig the words, and the only way at the end it was by reading the lips. So it was no longer by means of sound, but by means of choreography in that sense. And it's true that in my work, if one would have to say in terms of trajectory, it started with language, and then it became more choreographic, like the movement took over the translation of a situation. Particularly in this work, it's interesting because when you think in the relation of usually from your parents or from your mother, one of the early things you get is the language. And in the case of this film, I got the doubt about language, like the capacity to doubt language. And where it would join what you, Camille, was saying is that maybe what has also increased this doubt language is also the fact that since then, and this corresponded already to a moment when I was studying in France, so I left Albania, is that when you're not speaking your own language, you start seeing how language is opaque. And when you are within the territory, within your native setting, you do not see the opacity of the language. You do not see how much power is concentrated in the syntax, let alone the accent and many other attributes in the language which are not immediately connected to content. And so this would be like a very early example of my working with language. And it's true that the moment that it triggered this doubt, I started to become more and more interested in silence, and then silence give way to sound, and sound to music. And I became more interested in music as a way to maybe channel not as much communication, something that language does so explicitly, but channel relation in a more implicit way. But I would say that very recently I was working on a project which you just reminded me, La Cat. There is a film that I've done quite some time ago in Senegal with a few kids who are repeating words which are in Wolof, and Wolof is a very rich language. It has a very rich vocabulary to name all the differences, especially in skin color, but also in terms of light condition between pitch black all the way to very bright light or white, but has lost all the other primary colors, which have been over time, they only existed in French. And then at some point, well after I'd finished it last year, I wanted to translate it in Spanish, but not just, I mean, when you say Spanish, like Spanish is so present everywhere in the world. So I contacted somebody in Mexico who contacted other people, so I tried to translate it in if I may say, in Spanish, Venezuelan Spanish, Mexican Spanish, Argentinian Spanish. And what comes across when you translate these words, which have so much to do with hierarchy and skin color, etc., is that there are two things. First, that you see that Spanish has not translated itself the same way in all these countries. And another thing which it was completely, for me, like an epiphany, is that in the beginning I thought that some of the translators did not get it right, because there was some contradiction how the same word in two different countries, in Venezuela, say, and in Argentina or in Spain, was like the almost white was translated almost dark, or vice versa. And then I realized that it was also the color of the translator involved. So then there was the subjectivity of the translator. So many things come out the moment when you start questioning language and its transparency.
The question of translation was one I thought of too, which is, I mean, it's present in your work, particularly in that project. But Camille, with your Ikebana sculptures, and I think of that almost as a personal library project where you really engaged so many books that had some significance for you. And were you thinking of that as a translation project to sort of bring a part of the text into a sculptural form through flowers, or?
Yeah, I definitely was thinking about it as a translation project, because it's also the first project I did when I first moved here to New York, and also because all my books got blocked at the custom. I mean, it's not because there were books, but there was also a lot of other things, and I don't know exactly why it got blocked, but for 6 months I didn't get any of my things, the things I wanted to move to the US with. And but also I realized when I had studio visits that I was often referring to books that were not translated in English, or authors that was not very famous here. And I wanted to find a way that I can create a sort of evocation of these voices, but that would be immediate. A bit the same way you say, oh, you're talking about your parents and they are away, and you're like, oh, here's a picture of my father, here's a picture of my mother, and you can listen to a song and there's always a spirit. And the same way books have a music, they have a voice. Each author has a voice, and sometimes you would like to share this voice, but it's impossible because it's connected very much with the language it's been written with. So thinking about this idea, I imagined the possibility of translating a book into an object, and I couldn't think of anything more appropriate than a flower arrangement. Also because somehow to me there's a connection between these two objects with their function, which is consolation. Literature has always been somehow an art of consolation, and the flower arrangement, the Ikebana art later became a tradition of Buddhism, but at the very beginning, the Ikebana was exactly the same way we in Western countries do flower arrangement to honor the death.
Your mention of literature reminded me that I'd seen this quote that you borrowed in your book, Elephant Child. And it's a quote from Roland Barthes, and he says that language is fascist, but literature is a force for freedom.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could unpack that with us. And I think it's, I wonder if it's about languages. I mean, there's so many ways. There's a very literal way to interpret that, but I wonder if it's because language has conventions that we adhere to that is what makes it fascist, or?
It's because language, for example, in a way, language forces yourself to have to choose what gender you are, the degree of intimacy you have with one person, and thanks God, in English you don't have it because you just have you, but in French, immediately when you interact with somebody, you need to decide whether you say tu or vous, so you decide the distance you have, which is also sometimes connected with the respect. So it's something interesting to consider.
Like there's more hierarchies imposed.
Yes, and there is really an authority of language, and I think in the film of Anri, Tac Lac, we were talking about it. There is you feel very much the sort of like the pressure of the authority of language, which goes into this film very physical, just the exercise of the tongue to pronounce a word that hasn't been used, hasn't been trained to pronounce, and so there is two type of violence and two type of power that are being exercised on the individual with language, and one is the the precision of language itself, which is in a way not respecting the ambiguity of life. And the other aspect is the distance between different language, which is imposing on some people the use of a vocabulary that they are not really how do you say it, skilled or like educated to work with.
I think that's really what Lakakat gets at, is identifying this hierarchy within Wolof and really pointing at the way that French colonialism had this force and imprint in language, you know?
But it's also the fact that they are repeating it, and they are probably also too young to know all the impact of, or the full meaning of this hierarchy. Then it also becomes very musical. So I always said that if it's if the what they are saying, if it's too strong in terms of meaning, at the end of the day, it's also like a rhythmical repetition of the word, which reminds me, like when I was a kid, that I would repeat my own name often enough until I was foreign to myself, because it starts losing its own meaning. But I think this is where one of the reasons that drew me towards music, like what drew me towards music is not the pleasure of the melody or of how it sounds, but it's how it's a vessel that can convey without telling. So it's much more implicit. And also it carries its own opacity. For example, not all of us read music. We take it for granted that we all read the language. So the fact that this opacity is there, it also has this possibility, like you just said it so well, that it's much more ambiguous, so it's much closer to life. So there is there is so much clarity in the language that it can become very blinding to understanding of a situation.
It reminds me a bit of one sentence in your film, Intervista, where I think it's your mom who's saying, the closer you get, the more the more it loses meaning, or something like that.
Also in terms of the power, exactly like the closer you come to the dictator, the closer you came to the center of power, the more, first the more terrifying it became, but the more also it lost the whole meaning that it projected.
I want to go back to music for a second. I think, I can see a way that music entered into your work, maybe through your interest in music as a kind of language. But I think what you were just saying is much more complex than that. It is, we might say it's a language, but it communicates in a completely different way, right? And I think what you were also just touching on is one of the ways that you're interested in it is how it conveys something without words, without a story. And you've used a lot of musical pieces in recent work that have a kind of really specific historical time print. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit and how you end up choosing specific compositions that maybe have a historical significance or reveal something about a particular time. And I'm thinking about, not just Ravel, but the present moment, and maybe also the most recent work that you did with the Mozart piece.
Well, it's true that I'm interested in music, especially when it's music which has been already out there, like artifact, like something that tells a lot, not beyond the creativity that it contains. Some of them being masterpieces of Western compositions, for example, but they are also so telling about the society, the time they were composed. However, my approach to music and also the way how I like playing, deconstructing, rearranging it is not like from the point of view of an archaeologist, like somebody who wants to discover more about where they come from, but it's more as a way to unlock what is their future, like to bring them towards the present times, so to say.
Could you say a little bit about your most recent piece from Sydney?
Yeah,
as a way of describing
I was looking into a piece of music which was corresponding in time. It was composed at the same time as the arrival of the first fleet in Australia, and I went through a big list of musical pieces, and one of the most known ones was Mozart's concerto for bassette clarinet. So it was being composed. It's his last composition. Towards at the same time he composed Requiem, but it's contemporary to the arrival of the first fleet,
which was
and
a colonial.
Which exactly.
Yeah.
So it's one of the masterpieces of the European Enlightenment, but it also corresponds to this very difficult relation of Enlightenment with once it made it to other shores, how it produced loss and devastation for other ways of living, for other ways of being out there. And I wanted somehow to imprint in the music something which was foreign to its composition. I was interested because Enlightenment is also so much about, in what we appreciated about it is how it corresponds to a moment in the history of European civilization where the individual became more powerful. It also precedes the time of Mozart, precedes a little bit the moment when we start to realize the power in the artist being a genius. It's just a little bit before that, but it's leading towards that. And I was interested in doing something with the music where the composer loses its power. So it no longer travels to the listener according to the best intentions of the composer. And what I did with it is that I remember reading this book, which is a private journal, the only full existing one of somebody who traveled back then to Australia. And back then people would only travel by sailing by wind. So the first sentence in every day of the diary was about the wind. And English is a very rich language in terms of winds, also because of having traveled so much. So I took all this wind description and translated them into rhythmical values. Because when I think of wind, I think of pace, I think of tempo. So I took away all the tempi, original tempi of Mozart, and replaced them with the wind indications of this journey to Australia from London.
Could you say a little bit about the process of that translation?
Well, in a way, I'm simplifying it now, but in a way, it's a little bit like a day becomes a musical bar becomes a day. So I really did respect the chronology of the days. So I dealt with the wind indication as they were, and these wind indications, they took over with their tempo and rhythmical value. They took over the composition of Mozart. So in a way, it's like the composition of Mozart is like as if you put it in a bottle and then you throw it in the water, and then it's under the mercy of the weather, of the force majeure or acts of God. I like less the expression in English. So it's like the wheel has been taken over by another wheel. So I was interested also in this losing control, and also this masterpiece of the European Enlightenment somehow losing control, and the will of the composer losing control over the piece. And as it travels across all the days of the journal, and as it makes it on the way to Australia, the piece starts sometimes falling apart. When there is no wind, it becomes much slower. Sometimes when the wind is against the chronological order of the voices goes completely like instead of being from the solo to the tutti, it's the tutti first and then the solo. So you really want to see the impact of the weather on the musical piece. So the musical piece becomes like a collateral to this contemporary event, which was the arrival of the first fleet in Australia.
I'm gonna spin a little bit off this idea of the Enlightenment ideals that somehow fall short, but I think, I mean, it makes me think of how actually a number of your works are somehow looking at ways in which good intentions do precisely that, or good ideas turn sour. And in some cases, it's looking at particular political histories. I'm thinking of Long Sorrow, for example, or even maybe Answer Me, where you have this scene that looks like a relationship that's ended. And I'm curious if you've given some thought to what draws you to these scenarios.
I think what draws me in these scenarios is trying to not tell a story, trying to stay away from the narrative, but still there are some pre-narrative structures at play. That's why I speak of conveying rather than telling. In the case of Answer Me, which is like this setting of a couple splitting in this place in West Berlin, which is in a geodesic dome designed by Buckminster Fuller, and which was used by the CIA as a station to listen to communication between Soviet Union and the Eastern Allies. And I remember when I visited that place, I was struck by the echo in that place, but also knowing all the many layers in like the fact that that building is exactly in the highest point in the West Berlin. And why is it in the highest point? Is because Berlin is so flat. Its geography is the fact that that's where they amassed all the rubble of around 600,000 destroyed apartments, and it became like a hill. And then, in order to have a better reception for the spying and for the satellite, they built it exactly there. And why it's built exactly there? It's that Speer had built the technical military academy there, and it was so well built in terms of strength, it was too difficult to destroy, so instead they decided to cover it. So you have all these layers which are there, and then at the same time I wanted somehow the film not to be about the place, but I wanted the place to emanate itself within the film. So I lent, so to say, I borrowed a conversation that I found in a small book of Antonioni about all the ideas he had, or small sketches of ideas that he never made a film out of them. So I found this very small paragraph about him saying that he was interested to make a film about the splitting, which wouldn't have been the first one, where he said he was very interested not so much in what they had to say to each other, but the awkwardness in the silence in between. And there it was perfect because, like I said, I'm not interested in language as such, but in where language seasons itself, like the silence in between, with the difference that in that place, being so loud because of its acoustics, it would be more the loudness, the awkwardness in the loudness in between the words. So this is how I was drawn into to use a script, to use a scenario, not so much as to tell the story, but to become the fake foreground of a very important background to me, which was the acoustics and the place where the story was taking place. So it was about finding a foreground which would eventually let the background take over.
Camille, I want to jump to you for a minute and ask you about one of your recent works that's in your current show that's at Palais de Tokyo in Paris. It's this new film that you've made called Saturday, and you're looking at the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I know, you've taken up these themes of religion and mythology in other works before, but I'm interested to know what is it about religious practices or faith that attracts you? It seems to be, I also find it a kind of consistently fascinating subject, but I wonder if you could speak about that a bit.
For this film specifically, I wasn't thinking about religion in itself. I was more thinking about hope and how human beings maintain hope despite deception, frustration, and despair. So it's not really about religion, it's not about Seventh-day Adventists, but they are part of the film as a sort of reflection of our time too, because I feel like the way Seventh-day Adventists present themselves online, for example, their digital presence, but also the way they construct their images, also the teaching and the recommendation, the obsession around diet, in a way is not so distant from a sort of I would say contemporary moral that is circulating through digital media. The sort of obligation to be healthy, obligation to not hide anything from other people, this obligation of transparency. So this were very much, it's more about society and about community than about religion, this film specifically. Although the topic of faith is definitely something I'm interested in, and spirituality. But in a way, for me, it's the first time I approach a religious group, and somehow the topic is not religion. The topic is more hope, the hope for change, but also the relationship with transparency and truth. That because the film is also very connected with news. There is on the image there is a fluxus of news from the world that has been collected in a year, basically between November 2016 and November 2017.
Which are also go sometimes in the foreground and sometimes in the background.
Yes. Yeah, it's a play with the 3D technique. I mean, you probably didn't see it in 3D because you saw it on screen, but it's partially shot in 3D and partially shot in 2D, and the image shot in 2D is reconstructed in 3D. So, but a bit like with the sort of old school animated cartoon technique, like Walt Disney invented the multiplan. I don't know how you say in English, multiplan, which is the idea of like dividing an image into layers so as to reconstruct the idea of perspective, but fakely. And that so somehow this sort of billboard of news go behind object.
I wanted to touch a little bit on your relationship to the anthropology as a discipline, as a history, and as well. I know that you've read a lot of anthropology, and your project, The Pale Fox, was in some part inspired by what I think is basically an anthropological book, at least as flawed as one. But it's a book that's looking at cosmology, and I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you started to get into looking at, I mean, I know there's an even bigger story about your interest in cosmologies and that in the relation to gross fatigue, but maybe bring us back to when you first started thinking about anthropology and also thinking through its sort of flawed history.
I think, I mean, I didn't study anthropology. It just came a bit like randomly as a sort of like interest, you know. But first, I think it was through Lévi-Strauss, and then Lévi-Strauss brought me to Linhart, and then to Marlene Stratton, and then to other books. Originally, what I found really fascinating with anthropology is the problem of it, because it's a problem. It's a succession of unsolved problems. It's a science that, in a way, has no authority. It cannot really be a science, actually, because man cannot be object and subject at the same time. So anthropology is, I mean, apart from being having a colonial background, anthropology is highly problematic, constantly confronted with problems, also problem of representation, problem of distance, problem of giving back to the people anthropologists study. So that's where I found anthropology really interesting. Is basically for its unauthoritarian approach and the difficulty of it to when it comes to truth. There is so many doubts in anthropology. And I think in a way all the good anthropologists' books reflect a bit all these problems and these doubts and the internal conflict of this discipline. You were asking me about Pale Fox, but The Pale Fox is actually one of these books that are highly polemical in many countries, because it has been contested by many other anthropologists. The role he played in French anthropology is also very specific and special. And in a way, I choose this title because it's a bit of a confusion, you know. Because for me, anthropology is connected with this idea of misinterpretation and confusion. And I was thinking of Pale Fox as this book that I found, despite all the critiques that one can make on his relationship with truth, the book is by itself very, very fascinating, because it shows how a storytelling can be also an agriculture manual, a family planning manual, and an astrology and astronomy manual. So this is really interesting. But also to me, just the title, The Pale Fox, is highly poetic. And it evoked to me the role of the anthropologist itself, you know, being the fox, being curious, and being pale, being sick, you know, being sick of his curiosity, you know, curiosity as a disease.
I think, I mean, one way that I could also project your interest in anthropology is that it also shares an interest in structures of thought. And I know that's, you know, a subject that you've taken up in a lot of works. Is that something that has appealed to you in anthropology? And I guess maybe more so structuralist, but that's kind of where it's fun, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's also, in a way, the heart of the, you know, the center of the problem of anthropology is the structure. You know, being constantly balancing between whether what's more important is what is, you know, the global structure, or as opposite is the exception, you know, the structure of the exception, the structure of what is out. In a way, a structure only exists if there is an exception. And I found that basically in structuralism and the critique of structuralism, that both came from Lévi-Strauss originally, because he criticized structuralism himself very shortly after building it. There is very much this idea of the necessity of the structure, but coming together of the necessity of the structure, the necessity of the exception, and the attention towards the exception, giving the same importance to both the structure and the exception, because it's only in this sort of like, you know, being seated in between two chairs, basically, that you get a bit closer to a sort of approach of the situation in a way.
And I think what you were saying too about misinterpretations and misunderstandings kind of being embedded in the discipline and practice of anthropology is, you know, do you feel like that's, I guess I'm interested in how misunderstandings can be productive at times. Is that something that you've thought about in relation to that, or in relation to even your own experiences, kind of moving between languages, moving between media? And
I'm not sure you can say that misinterpretation is productive.
Maybe misunderstandings.
Or misunderstanding, but it's unavoidable. So then the question is whether you choose to stay in your own field where you understand everything and you speak your own language and you can study or like work with things that are so familiar that you're not too much at risk of misinterpreting it, or whether you, despite the risk of misinterpretation or misunderstanding, you still go and approach as an artist, but also, I mean, as scientific topics and things that are foreign to you. I think, I mean, definitely in arts, there has been a very productive story of misinterpretation, of misunderstanding. I think it's, I'm not sure it's completely, it's not a value. That's what I would say. It's not a value per se, and it's not something to be researched as a goal. But in my opinion, it's just something not to be afraid of.
We're nearing the end of our time, but I wanted to also offer you a chance if you have any questions for one another.
Yes, but you want to start?
Well, we start. You want first? Please.
Okay. No, I was thinking about you know, the conversation we had a bit before. We just both realized we experienced an earthquake, a very big earthquake, and while talking through this experience of both being present, Henri in Mexico and me in Japan, when a very serious earthquake was happening. You were telling me the story that the earthquake you experienced happened very shortly after the repetition about what to do when the earthquake actually happened. And it made me think about, I mean, something I found really interesting in your work is the role of replay things being played 2 times or like prepared and then played again, which to me is very interesting because I think that's the way you include audience in the process. Like even when for example, in the different piece where you integrate music, and you were talking about the role of the composer, and I think that's very. I'm very intrigued about, what is the starting point for you for using this idea of replay, and what does it mean to you in relationship with the audience?
I think you gave this example of the earthquake, and it's true. Like when I was in Mexico, it happened that the earthquake happened the same day, 32 years after the infamous one. So somehow the memory of something which had happened was staged. People came out, but then 1.5 hours later, the original new earthquake happened. And I found it very interesting how the repetition took place before the original, and especially in the way how everybody perceived it. And I've always been very interested in this. How could one be one step ahead of the original? Like, what is the original event? As an example, I would say there is a project that I did a long time, quite some time ago. I was very interested to ask a known music band if they could hand me over a song that they were about to release, but a few months before, and I'd find a way for people to be able to read the rhythm of it without listening to it and to guess what the song would be. And then we did it, and actually it was with Franz Ferdinand and the song that became their single Ulysses. So people could just read what would be the rhythmical value of it based on words that I took from Ulysses of Joyce, and they would start guessing what would be the real song. And there are so many recordings that we did, and eventually some of them came very close to the original, which would only come out later. And the idea, which then somehow on its way, I never did it, it was to release the fakes before the original. So it's also questioning a little bit like what is the what is the first event? But I think this also opens the door that it gives more space to the subjectivity of the viewer or the listener about what is the first event. Like, is one ahead of the event, or is one following or arriving just after the event? Yeah, I don't know if it's fully answered, and I think it's time for my question. No, but this is also a question that I want to ask. It's also, music is so important in your films. And I'm very intrigued and interested to know at what point in the conception of an idea, or when you're thinking of an idea, at what point music takes over. At what point it joins the other elements, or is it the first element to unfold?
There's many different configuration according to the different project, but it's true that I started doing music video. So my very first films right after school were music videos. So music was a starting point. And my first 3 films were a sort of reverse music video where I asked the musician I had been doing music video for to create a soundtrack for films. But I already had the music very much in my head, and often I have a sort of a series of songs that are reference with like, oh, I like the beat of this song, and I like the use of this instrument, that other, and so I already kind of have an idea of what type of music I want, and very often with the musician we start working a bit ahead of the film with a sort of maquette, a sort of like short, test, and it gives a bit it gives me already direction for conceiving the film. Sometimes when we edit, it's complicated because I like to have to have no music at all, and I also like to have it. So it's just I'm like, oh no, I don't want the music. We'll do the music later, because I always like the narrative of the image to create themselves. That's Course Fatigue, for example, was a film which was impossible to edit with the music at first because there was too much footage, and there was really the need for sort of like structure, pure visual structure, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. But then once the music is there, you have to adapt to it as well. So it changed again the editing of the film. So it's very much a sort of like back and forth. But the music is very often in my intention, and in some form of in the background of my head while conceiving the film.
So it's something which is almost like it gives like architecture of time within a film.
Yeah, very much. It's also a sort of it's interesting to see how music is such a strong conveyor of emotion. It's really, really strong, so it has to be manipulated with a lot of delicatesse. I don't know how to say, like you have to be very careful about how you use it. And I think in your work it's also something that is very interesting. Is sort of like very often I notice you have this tendency to also make the music more abstract, or like remove element, make it more like a sort of skeleton of what it is, which is very much what happened with the music box. And I feel very connected with this strategy, because often when you work with music and images, you realize that image is so strong that you need the music to get to something very primary and very much more abstract and much more simplified in a way, which wouldn't be the type of music that most of the composers you work with would do if they were to make a music by themselves. So you have to work with them towards this direction that that it becomes more and more like a sort of skeleton. It becomes more essential.
It's also that we both work so much with time-based mediums or elements, and it's true that music has a lot of closeness with the idea of being in the present moment, because it's like it's known that the longest present moments happen during within music. Present moments being these fragments of time where you cannot split them further into before, now, and what is coming after. So in a way, it just enables you to stay within this present moment without yet dealing with the problematics that language brings, which is the present tense, the past tense, the future tense.
I don't want to cut you off, but our present moment has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really fun.